How do I? That's okay. I'm good. I was like, how do I start introducing the podcast? Because I had
with a clapper.
Introduced hosts, did a clapper. Hello and welcome to the integration station. That's how I start, don't I?
That is how you start.
Hello and welcome to the Integration Station. I'm your host, Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me today is my co-host, Eleanor.
I'm also a child and adolescent occupational therapist.
Welcome, Eleanor. Thanks for coming into Plus today.
No, I always love an excuse to come to Plus. It's great here.
Yeah, good spot.
How's your week been?
It's been okay. I've got a sick child at home at the moment, so a little bit rough sleep last night, but that is okay. That happens.
We'll be talking about sleep today as well, so maybe you can lean into that a little bit more.
I did actually see a question about sleep today, and I thought, is today the day to do it? Maybe it is the day to do it.
Yeah.
So yes, we do get questions that come in our Q&A format. So if you do have any questions, please send them through to podcast@OTFC Group, the email address there. Otherwise, Instagram, OTFC Group on Instagram is the handle you can use to send through questions. And we did get some this week, as you said.
We did.
We are having a bit of a neurodiversity theme for the month. I say that, but I think just about every week we talk about something to do with neurodiversity or neurodivergence in general anyway. But certainly with Neurodiversity Week in mid-March, we thought we'd spend a bit more time focusing on some particular concepts.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I got an email recently. There is a Neurodivergence Wellbeing Conference, which is happening in the Gold Coast this year.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so first of its kind from what I know in terms of the organisation. It puts on a range of conferences. That's the first one they're doing about neurodivergence. So, and some really, really great people on the committee as well. So have a look into it. If you just Google Neurodivergence Wellbeing Conference, we can put a link in the show notes as well. Some great learning, I'm sure, will come from that.
Therapy activity of the week.
Never gets old. What's your therapy activity of the week? Do you want me to go first? I wrote one down.
I saw that in
Did
your
you?
little prep, which I love. No, go on.
great.
You seem really excited about that. You go first.
Look, it's not one I did this week.
But it's a classic. I saw.
So it's a bit
spoiler,
of a cheat,
I saw it.
cheat code. I reflected back on one that I was missing doing, because at Plus we have suspension points, and a lot of the sensory integration therapy really relies on having suspension points, and suspension points are, places, beams up high to attach swings, and swings are very much part of the therapy. And one of the issues with Plus is we don't have suspension points in a sequence that allows you to have 3 items hooked up at once.
Yeah.
Whereas in the smaller rooms, you do have that. I think people have different names for it. I call it Log of Fire.
If you were thinking of the same game, I also have the same.
Log of Fire? Okay.
Same title.
Yeah. So essentially in the middle of the room, you have 3 points. The 2 outer suspension points have what's called a log swing, or what else do they call it?
Bolster?
Bolster. That's probably the other word that the Americans like to use, the bolster swing. So that's in the middle. With suspension points either side. And in this middle suspension point, you have a trapeze. And so the person has to hold on to the trapeze whilst the bolster swing's moving back and forward.
Yeah.
So you don't want to get hit by the log of fire.
Seems simple.
Seems simple, but it's hard.
But there's lots of grading within that too, which
Absolutely.
I really like.
So it's how long can you keep your arms up for, how many swings of the swing underneath while you're holding on, or sometimes you might do almost like a skipping thing where you have to jump up as the log comes past, and on the way back you have to time it so you're jumping up before the log gets you on the way back down. And I'm doing lots of gesturing here with my hands, which is great for the video people, but not for radio. But it is an excellent task for bilateral skills, for timing and endurance. My gosh, I remember doing that
So much.
so tiring.
And you like that postural control as well, tucking the legs every time to come over. Yeah, it's an awesome activity.
Yeah, a good one, and gone but not forgotten.
And I actually did that the other week with one of my friends. Right. And I always love this game, and I had the exact same thought that I hadn't done it in ages. I just feel like it targets so many key areas in a way that's really fun. I often do it in 3 stages and like a little bit of a competition between myself and the client if they're, if they enjoy or are motivated by that kind of, where we'll have 1 round, we both get a few attempts to see what's the maximum jumps over the log while it's stationary. And the second round is with it swinging, so really bring in that timing element. And the last one I do is get them to balance on top of the log swing. So the fire is gone and now it's becoming like a surfboard. But of course we send waves in every now and again just to try and add a bit of movement and challenge those equilibrium reactions and those postural reactions even further. And it's just one of those ones that you just change those little elements and it just can take a whole session to go through that. It's just, really fun.
Great
as
activity.
well. Yeah, it's so good.
How about yours?
Mine was, I was doing a game on the trampoline. Actually, we put a whole bunch of gym balls on the trampoline and the aim was to go from one side of the trampoline to the other to deliver an item to the other side whilst remaining only on the gym ball, so you couldn't touch the trampoline underneath. So it's almost like this rollover to get to the other side, and we do it so that each time we get across successfully, we take a gym ball out just to challenge the planning. The client can rearrange the gym balls so they can think about, well, how can we best maneuver this to be able to get across effectively? So there's like the planning and the ideation, and I think as you're stepping that down to that balance and that core control is challenged even further and trying to be strategic. And once again, it's a really fun game too, because if you fall off, which is fine, that's all part of the process. It's just fun to crash in amongst that too. So really good input throughout, and it just, laugh it off and let's try again. What can we do differently?
A very unpredictable surface going along gym balls.
Exactly. But I've also seen it done, it could be on the floor to stabilize that a little bit more, and just using, equipment to make a bit of a pen.
We have it in here at times. People put the gym balls in the spider wall, which is like the two Perspex walls side by side, so they're parallel, and you squeeze gym balls in there and they have to sort of navigate their way through that way as well. So full body workout, that one.
Yeah. I even feel like if you were, say, in a smaller space or the home environment, maybe you don't have multiple gym balls, but you have even one to use to like roll over. Maybe you're using it playing a card game or something. So every time you take a turn, you have to roll over and then come back. Yeah. So I think it's quite versatile.
Great. Let's go with the regulation strategy of the week.
Regulation, the strategy of the week.
What do you got?
I actually was hoping to have a little just follow-up and reflection from a reg strat that I shared the other week.
Please.
When we were talking about the deep breathing exercises, and we were using it as part of a swing, and it translated to an unexpected moment that happened in the session too. And I had the pleasure of seeing that friend this last week, and the parent shared with me that my little friend had been using that a lot over the week, and actually recognizing at a few different points when maybe hearing the tone of someone's voice or how they were speaking or what they were describing, that perhaps there was a bit of tension that was kind of manifesting in their body and bigger emotions about something that they were experiencing. And he was able to cue into them to go, we should take a deep breath and let it go. And so we built upon that, this week saying, but all our feelings are correct and valid, and it's okay to feel whatever you need to feel. But it's just important that we put those things in place to help shift that, not in as many words as what I'm describing with you guys right now, but just very simply, it's okay to feel all your feelings. But when we need to, we can take a deep breath and let it go. And it just was so nice to hear how that had translated across the week, and had started with something really silly and fun in, this is how we get the swing to move, big breath in, exhale, and the swing goes. But that had generalized to a different setting across the week, which was pretty awesome. And I was so excited to hear that story and hear how that had played out since I saw them last.
Wow. That's exactly why you do what you do.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually, it was really taken aback. It was, really awesome to hear.
That's amazing, because that's, at the end of the day, as an OT, that's what you want. You want a young person to take a concept on that they've either come up with themselves or they've shared with you, or you've collaborated with them to develop, and then for them to take that on and use that themselves in their own way, in their own life. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff.
And I think I shared too, when I was initially trying to introduce it, there were ways that I thought might work, like with bubbles and things like that, but that just wasn't as motivating or didn't make as much sense. Like that grip onto the idea hadn't really happened, but just following his lead, we were able to adapt that, and it's been really awesome to hear. What's yours for this week? What's on your notes?
My notes, I wrote down loops, for the ears.
Oh yeah.
The loops. They're like earbuds.
Yeah.
And designed to cancel out noise, but instead of like the really soft, foamy, squishy earplugs that you can put in that just block everything out, they do allow some sound through, and you can get varying levels of them, and they're quite comfortable.
Yeah.
And the ones there are a variety of them, some that have more noise cancellation than others, and some that do allow a bit of sound through, and they're ones designed for sleep. And I was actually working with a
that's
client
cool. Yeah.
looking at some that he could potentially wear while he's sleeping to help cut out excess noise around him. That one was the one that I was thinking of.
They must have a special design, because I would have thought some of that inner ear support would be potentially uncomfortable, but they must have.
Yeah, they're a bit squishy, a bit flatter on the outside. So
that's
if you
cool.
think about it, it's like a little ear bud that goes into your ear, and then the loop has essentially like a little loop that sticks out. It's quite subtle, but the sleep one is a bit flatter. So
yeah, that sounds good.
easy to sleep on, apparently. I haven't actually tried it myself.
Okay.
But I've definitely fallen asleep with my noise cancelling earphones in.
Yeah.
And it's been fine. But yes, a good regulation strategy for those that need to cut out noise.
Yeah, for sure.
If they can.
I think we'll cover that off a little bit more generally today,
Sleep.
won't we? Yeah, talking about sleep strategies, because funnily enough, I'm the opposite. I like to have like a bit of noise in the background as I initially fall asleep. But then, yes, I guess would be very sensitive to noise overnight though. So if I was to wake up due to noise, I would find that really hard to go back to sleep.
So we've got a few questions. One, as you said, we've had a question come in about difficulties in falling and staying asleep. There was a question on what is neurodiversity, but I think we covered that.
Hopefully we can refer back to a previous episode around that.
But the first one we might start with is the current evidence for SI when working with neurodivergent populations. And there has been quite a bit more research into working with neurodivergent populations and SI. And I think back to end of last year, October, when we were at the ISIC Congress, International Sensory Integration Congress. There were a range of speakers, presenters, topics related to various neurodivergent populations, whether it's autism, ADHD, learning difficulties, a whole range of things, and talking about essentially using SI to support these populations. Yeah. There is actually a whole book. Suzanne Smith-Rowley wrote a book, I think it was the early 2000s, called Sensory Integration. I think it's called Sensory Integration for Diverse Populations. I think it's the title. I have to double check that. But her book, which she wrote with some other key SI people, was explaining, 20 years ago now, how to use SI with a variety of presentations. Yeah, absolutely. And different neurodevelopmental presentations. And so before the advent and the awareness of the terms neurodivergence, neurodiversity, there were people within SI that were working with a variety of presentations of young people and employing ASI. Yeah. So obviously I'm biased, being an ASI therapist, but I can certainly see that there has been a lot of work done in the past working with a variety of people. But in terms of current evidence, what do we got? Well, actually, speaking of the Congress, I just loved hearing Roseanne Schaaf speak about the journey within that. And she just spoke so brilliantly and so passionately. She really is, such a pioneer in the field. And I found it really interesting to hear about the journey that brought around the range of evidence that now exists around sensory integration, and particularly around autistic populations. I guess thinking about where that lands in the neurodiversity space. And I guess she had shared that, if I was recapping some of the things that she spoke about, how I guess anecdotally up before a certain point they had seen a lot of gains. So exactly like you'd mentioned, that ASI had been used for some time in neurodiverse young people, but it became, I think it was almost being labelled as an approach that didn't have the evidence base behind it. Right. And so they really wanted to make sure there were these rigorous, robust studies to support what they were doing and to support what they were seeing and to really shift that perspective. And Roseanne spoke a lot about, I guess, how they had worked to set that up, which did include a randomised control trial in 2018 for ASI in autistic population, using the intervention manual, because I think that was a key component that, when it comes to these studies, they have to have a really specific way of administering things to make sure that it is translatable. They can re-administer it in the same way in different spaces and have a similar result. And That's essentially what a randomized control
Yeah.
trial is. Yeah, that
Yeah.
sort of approach. Yeah, yeah.
And I think they recognize, it sounds like they really recognize the need for that. And they use the goal attainment scale or the GAS to help identify where those improvements were.
Yeah.
So that's an opportunity for that individual or their family's caregivers to set personal goals and then be able to identify where therapeutic intervention has been able to support in progressing in those goal areas.
So the goal attainment scale essentially is, maybe for those who don't know, it's kind of like you set a goal as a collaborative.
Yeah.
And then you have sort of like, it's like
There's 5 tiers, I
there's
suppose.
5 tiers.
Yeah.
Like I've achieved greater than that by a couple of levels, or or the goal has been met at the level expected, or
Less than expected.
Yeah. And so you've kind of got like a grading scale of, but something to go with for that goal.
Exactly. And you can it provides some evidence about how you're working towards these goal areas and the progress that you're making. And I guess you can use that as something over time as well. So use it at certain points to check in and go, well, where are we against a goal that we might have set?
Yeah.
And, I guess where they were looking at was, yes, how the progress compared against these goal attainment scales, and certainly showed the benefit within that, which is excellent, especially showing as that was one of those first high rigor cases that have been presented in ASI. And what followed on from there is there's, additional systematic reviews that they conducted highlighting the benefits of ASI with a focus in autistic populations. And actually she was able to share with us that there was a tool in America. It's called the Evidence-Based Practices for Children, Youth and Young Adults with Autism. Now I recognize this is American-based, but I think shows where this progress has reached in other places, but then where we still have to go from here. And they actually had listed ASI in this manual as a evidence-based practice, which is huge because prior to that, the recognition hadn't necessarily been there. And I really liked as a bit of a differentiation that they had reflected in here. Earlier versions of this report had just referred to ASI as sensory integration. And I think we've spoken on this in previous episodes where it's important to make that distinction between what is formally classified as ASI in air sensory integration and those that are other sensory integration therapies that perhaps is quite separate to that.
Yeah, or sensory-based therapies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And kind of cementing its place from there. So that's the evidence, I guess, that's been going on in America by, the Avengers as we call them.
Yeah.
But other pioneers in that space and growing that evidence base in those areas. But, when we were at that conference, I think they very much recognise that there is so much growth that's required from here. And there was the Novak study that was done in Australia that, which I think, once again, we've spoken to in previous episodes, that showed the need for that growing evidence within Australian research. And I think a key point that they had mentioned was that the evidence shows progress against things like these goal attainment scales, but they wanted it to be really specific in functional areas about, for example, how ASI supports with improvements in addressing tasks or handwriting and having that really strong focus and link to be able to progress that understanding more broadly.
And I think, yes, we have mentioned in the past the Novak study. So that was a journal article that was undertaken, I think it was about 2019 in the Australian Journal of Occupational Therapy that pretty much put a do not do for ASI.
Yeah.
And if anybody that's interested, I think it's a free access article out there. Absolutely have a look through it. There's a whole range of other, recommended therapeutic approaches in there. And if you have a look through what they've classified as sensory integration, it's adjuncts or spin-offs, if you will, of what true ASI is, and hence why a lot of the key players in air sensory integration took umbrage to that and said, hang on, this is not a true reflection of what actually the therapy is, and came back with a vengeance and put a lot of time and effort into ensuring that the evidence base is there because like anything, like your reputation's on the line. So if you see something like that and go, hang on, this is not a reflection of what we're actually trying to do, then you'll spend a lot of time trying to work towards creating a therapeutic approach that is evidence-based, that does have strong rigor, not just for the research, but for the families and the children that are accessing the service, to go, what you're doing is going to support them. Anecdotally, we've seen it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is the thing, when we're talking about current research for neurodivergent populations, anecdotally, I've seen it work for neurodivergent populations for many years. But until the research had been so solid and the evidence base was so strong that it is part of these guidelines in the US, and also, the Autism CRC in Australia do recognise the effectiveness of air-sensory integration now. And the Autism CRC is kind of like your gold standard, your Bible of anything to do with guidelines for assessment, diagnosis of autism and treatments for autism within Australia. When they're saying that what's within air-sensory integration is effective based on the research, it's saying this is good. It's good to go. We've greenlit this as a therapeutic approach.
Yeah.
That for me is the best sort of outcome of all of this, is to say, if you're a clinician, if you're a family, whoever you are that's using this therapeutic approach, that you can be rest assured that what you're doing has an evidence base to it. It has anecdotal evidence as well, which we've seen, but it has an evidence base to it. And that evidence base can be backed up by science and research. And the one thing I'd say, I'm only saying this because I think really important, because we're talking about, Neurodiversity Month, is that SI is so specific to that client. So that one person has a treatment approach, has therapy, has, what you're doing with them for one person. What you're doing for one person is different to the next person, to the next person.
Yes, absolutely.
Hence why it's so hard for it to have been done as a randomized control trial in other ways, because of how bespoke the actual therapy is. Yes, there are principles and there are fidelity measures, and we've mentioned that in the past, but what I do for one person with autism that's 10 years old is going to be completely different to what I do with another young person who's 10 years old with autism.
Yes, exactly.
And so when I'm thinking of it being neuroaffirming, I know there's misconceptions around the fact that there's, you're trying to change, or you're trying to, fix, or the therapy's aimed at addressing difficulties, or, their scores indicate that they're not good at something. Whereas I think we are getting much better, and the SI gurus are very much understanding that it's not about that. It's about understanding that some of those sensory differences impact function. And at the end of the day, we're just trying to improve function.
Yeah.
And the therapy should be specific to support that young person and understand that profile. And then the assessment and the research is to better understand the profiles of the young people we're working with, so you can tailor a therapeutic approach. It's the same as if we're going down the path of giving someone, I often use the analogy of, the different approaches to the medical model. You can give someone like a whole bunch of medication and say it's fine, or you can go through and look at their history and make it very, very individualized to what they need, and maybe medication's not always what they need, for example. I can't remember the term.
Oh, no, I can't help you out.
remember,
sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. I remember Roseanne was talking about it in her talk as well, but changing that model. And I think that's where that social model of disability has certainly come into play here as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's where I think we can certainly tie into what ASI does with neurodiversity. I've gone off a bit of a tangent there.
No, I've been right there on that journey with you. And I think, even if I was referring that back to some of the evidence that I've mentioned as part of this discussion, the outcomes that they're talking about is like those personal goals in self-care tasks, in daily functioning. It's looking at the amount of support that a caregiver might require in supporting their young person. And it's looking at, I guess some of those emotional regulation skills as well. And at no point, the way that I'm interpreting that is how we very much apply ASI therapy here, in which it's about helping that young person access things that they need to work towards their potential and flourish as the best version of themselves, and grow independence in any way that they can. And it's not about fixing or correcting. And that's certainly not what the evidence is suggesting either. And you're exactly right. It's a child-led therapy. When they talk about these intervention manuals as part of the evidence, that's actually for the therapist, not in what is the expected outcome for that young person, which is tailored and individualized. The intervention manual is for the person delivering that, and to hit certain markers as what they're doing to say that they're delivering on ASI, rather than that one size fits all for what it might look like for the child. And a huge part of that is around being child-led and being collaborative and tapping into that young person's intrinsic motivation to play. You know, and then
Absolutely.
for the therapist to include certain elements like have they had the opportunity to access proprioceptive, vestibular and tactile input? Has the therapist been able to set a just right challenge that supports success while extending that young person? Has the therapist been able to assist in that young person meeting their regulation needs? Like, it's not a tick box about what the outcome is, and that set's quite separate to them.
We're going to have to do a fidelity measures podcast.
We are, I think.
We keep mentioning it every week. You keep coming up with the different things, and I think at some point we're just going to have to bite the bullet and just put a fidelity measures podcast out there for anybody that's out there and wants to know a bit more about what makes air-sensor integration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of these key studies too, we'll make sure that we link them for people who are interested in accessing these, because there's really great information available that shows very positive outcomes for ASI in this particular space. But of course, there's always scope. I think we walked away from the conference going, is this something that we want to be involved with? Like, what's the first research we're going to do?
Absolutely. And I know that CLASI, the collaborative leadership in air-sensor integration, the body that a lot of the air-sensor integration gurus have formed, have research briefs. So their website has really good summarised information, a few pages of the most recent research in supporting ASI as an effective and evidence-based practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even as part of that conference, like, yes, we heard from some of these really key American studies, but we heard from people from all over the world, like 30 different countries that are doing research in this space. So I think it's only going to continue to grow, but there is some excellent initial evidence to support that application in therapy.
Excellent. I hope we haven't put the body to sleep after that discussion. But we're going to talk about sleep.
Well done. You feel good about that one?
Yeah, it's all right. It did the job. We did a podcast, I think it was a couple of years back. We had fantastic OT called Annie O'Connell. Annie O'Connell, she's actually done heaps and heaps, and she's South Australian, has done heaps of stuff on sleep. I think her master's was in the effectiveness of waterbeds. This is back in the early 2000s, and the effectiveness of waterbeds for autistic people.
Yeah, right.
And she spent a lot of time doing that, and that kind of kickstarted her passion into understanding more about sleep. And for many years, you know, she developed a Sleepwise manual that was adopted by the South Australian government in terms of supporting young people in developing sleep strategies. Had some fantastic stuff to say about sleep. So for anybody that's listening, go back through the back catalogue, and we did a couple of episodes with her a few years back. But the question we had was, how do we support difficulties in falling and staying asleep? And I mean, I don't know if it's just for children, this one, or if it's generally for general population, but there are, you know, sleep is, I've always, you know, I have done the sleep training that Annie O'Connell did, that she developed a number of years ago. And sleep is just such a fascinating thing.
Yeah.
You know, everybody does it. Everybody needs it. And so it's, you know, like eating and toileting and other things. It's your common denominator that everybody, doesn't matter who you are, has to do those things. In terms of the question about falling asleep, so there are different things there compared to staying asleep. And I guess the one common factor across both those concepts is circadian rhythms. And for those that might not know, circadian rhythms is essentially your body clock.
Okay.
You know, so it's like a biological clock in the brain that responds to light. So when you are sensing that when it's dark, you have parts of your brain that help promote sleep onset, and things like melatonin. So melatonin you may have heard of as like a medication that people take. So the body produces melatonin at night to help with that onset of sleep. And so the circadian rhythms are designed to go with the natural flow of light and dark. So essentially, when it's light, the body should be awake.
Yeah.
When it's dark, the body should be
And your body
to sleep.
naturally tries to cue in with that.
Correct.
Sure.
And that's you know, helps regulate your sleep cycle every 24 hours.
Yeah.
So when it senses light, when that circadian rhythm senses light, it switches off the melatonin. So it produces melatonin to help you get to sleep.
Yep.
And then the melatonin switches off to help you wake up.
yeah,
and then other
sure.
things like cortisol and other things happen in the morning. Those other
Alerting.
responses in the body to help you wake up. And there are other neurotransmitters involved in that as well. For a lot of our autistic population, there is growing evidence that they don't have, they aren't able to produce as much melatonin as maybe some others. And so there's a greater difficulty with sleep onset.
Okay.
And that can happen at a very young age, so you will hear a lot more young children potentially having melatonin supplements to help with settling them to sleep.
Sure.
And there are other natural things like tryptophan, which is in a lot of other foods, and that can help settle people to sleep. And of course, there are other medications to help lower blood pressure and other things, but obviously that's a separate thing. But from a natural perspective, that melatonin should be kicking in to help you get to sleep. Now, if that young person or an individual is finding it hard to do that, what are the reasons? There are a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
There are so many, and I think one thing I see for a lot of younger children in terms of getting to sleep that can be quite hard is that potentially throughout their day they haven't had enough of the sensory input that they need.
Yeah.
And I guess from your perspective, you might see, maybe you've seen that as one of the more common reasons as to why kids find it harder to get to sleep.
Yeah, I've just had a few families that I've seen recently when they'll almost report in. It's like, my kid's like bouncing off the walls just before bedtime, and I can see that they're tired, but they just like that settling to sleep is really tricky. And I've actually been working with this gorgeous young man who I think that was something that he had been navigating a lot at home. I also recognize that he is someone that just tries his best every day at school, works really hard. And we talk about this a lot, and we'll just work to meet those demands, and then comes home in that safe space and that mask comes off. But we have exploring a lot around sensory-based strategies that might be able to support him in settling to sleep. And it's been so awesome to hear from the family the impact that has had. And I'm not saying that this works for everyone. And of course, everyone's sensory needs and preferences are different. But I think as OTs, especially in the ASI space, that's often where we start in trying to understand what those needs might look like and how we can better incorporate that. So yes, it's exactly that. It's the opportunity for proactive movement opportunities across the day so that we can more effectively meet those needs. And then the things that I'd suggested for the family to try at home are things like they've been doing like wrestling before bed. And I know there's the video that Dino had put out, which is a pretty awesome explanation as to why that's effective. But even things like steam rollers, using a gym board, I think that was your regulation strategy. The other week. Hot dog rolls, like this really grounding proprioceptive input, but targeted just prior to bedtime routines. And apparently that's been so helpful for him, which is brilliant. But once again, that's about trying a few different things, seeing what works, what doesn't. When do we schedule it in our nighttime routines? How long for? And being super individualized in how you approach that. But that was even just, that was kind of the first place that we went to within that. And it was, brilliant to hear that had already been so impactful for him.
And I guess the other thing, in terms of ways to work through that or ways to support falling asleep is sleep hygiene, and we talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
But I don't want to start banging on about sleep hygiene because I know for so many families, particularly of, neurodivergent young children or children in general, is that sleep hygiene can be really hard. Like they want to have a good sleep routine and they want to put things in place. Things like screen time obviously can have a big impact. Like I haven't even talked about that, but there is a desire to make that happen, but it just can be really, really hard.
Yeah, and the practicalities of it too, I think, can be really tricky, especially if you're managing multiple needs, competing
and multiple
needs.
children.
In the household.
I find it hard getting my son to sleep at the best of times with one, and that's two on one. If it's 2 on 2, it's even. If it's 3 on 2, you're outnumbered.
Yeah.
Who does that? And for a lot of these kids, it's not mentioned in here per se so far, but in terms of settling to sleep or falling asleep, how many kids still require a level of co-regulation?
Yeah.
They need a parent there to help support them to settle to sleep.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't, and lots of kids co-sleep, and sleep practices are different for a number of reasons. There's a lot of cultural perspectives to that as well. But, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. It's just about trying to find something that's routine and something that's consistent and does actually work. And it works for that young person. And I remember, in one of the episodes when I was talking to the sleep, Annie O'Connell, the sleep OT, she was talking about, I think it's unrealistic to completely turn off screens for some kids, particularly the high needs kids that need something to help settle to sleep. But she said, if you're playing the same Finding Nemo movie over and over again with a red filter on it at night, then maybe that works and it helps them settle to sleep. And not that she's advocating for screen time at all, but she's saying you find what works.
Yes.
And sometimes that can help. So in terms of falling and settling to sleep, that's just one part. We could talk about it for ages, but staying asleep's another thing. And staying asleep's a hard thing because that also comes into the circadian rhythms as well. And so whilst melatonin helps to settle you to sleep or helps to, start that onset, it won't keep you asleep the whole time because throughout the night there are, different the waves of things that happen, and there are different neurotransmitters that support relaxation or switch things off and turn things on and dampen senses during the time. But kids can often wake during the night, or people can wake during the night for a number of reasons. I think of as an adult, if I've had too much coffee one day, I might wake during the night because just had too much caffeine.
Yeah.
Or
from like stress, things that you're managing across the day, and like what those cortisol levels that stress hormone looks like within your body, and that can impact, I suppose, across both of those spaces. Falling asleep, but also if you were to wake up in the night, it might be that those higher levels are impacting upon that. Yeah, so many things that.
Yeah, and so staying asleep does become a lot more challenging then, and. I think for any of these things, if it is a consistent thing in terms of falling asleep or even staying asleep, then there are sleep consultants.
For sure.
And there are specialists that do address that. But at the same time, I know that it is also a matter of trying to find what is, what's going to work for that young person. And sometimes some of those approaches don't always work for families and the young person as well. So, it's good to shop around or get some different insights. And as an OT, I'm always thinking of how do we support from a sensory perspective? If they wake up in the middle of the night, how are we able to resettle them using sensory strategies, whether it's, white noise, whether it's, smells that are soothing or settling, whether it's the use of a weighted item, things to help resettle. But sometimes it can be really hard when that biological clock is saying, I'm ready to go now. Yeah. I'm awake and it's 3 o'clock and let's do it. Yeah. The day's starting, right?
Yeah.
So I do understand that there are, there are a lot of factors here, but falling and staying asleep can be hard. The one thing I will mention though is that, for teenagers in particular, there are a number that do have that sort of delayed sleep onset or delayed sleep phase, and that's quite a common thing. So lots of, I have lots of families come in and say, oh, they go to bed later and they wake up later and it's such a problem. Like, well, FYI, that there are that's not uncommon for teenagers as they're starting to, hormones are starting to change and they're going through that adolescence. That does actually happen. So they will try and push bedtimes later and they will get up later, and that it's becomes more of a problem if it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
But that is a natural thing that does happen. But there's a lot there in sleep, and I feel like it just sort of touched on only a couple of things there, but potentially answering that question is understanding more about what the sleep routines are before, and in terms of staying asleep, what is helping getting that person asleep, and how can you maybe replicate that when they're waking to redo some of those routines during the night as well.
Yeah, for sure. And some of the things like we spoke about, sleep hygiene is a really helpful place to start. But I do appreciate when there are so many families, so many young people just really working to make this work and to make these routines work. But it is, if it's something that perhaps you hadn't started with in the first instance, a really good opportunity to review that, see how you could build that into your routine, think about those environmental aspects and routines. And I guess, big one for us, thinking about that young person's sensory needs and seeing what we can incorporate from a regulation perspective to help our body settle and be more in a space to to go to sleep. And I think, you'd mentioned a few things around medications that might be used to support. And I think if it's something that you feel like your young person's really struggling with and it's impacting on their function during the day, I think speaking with your doctor can be really helpful, just to flag that and go like, this is something that we're working through at the moment. It is always, always your choice about what that looks like, what approaches you take with any of those things that you'd mentioned, just making sure that any options around that are spoken with your medical team first.
Looking at through a holistic lens, trying to find as many avenues to support someone as they can. Because normally when kids don't get much sleep, that means the parent's not getting much sleep either. So
I think it's often not that it's just one, there's no one magic fix, and actually often it's building in multiple things that can support. But at the end of the day, just trying to work out what works best for you, what feels practical, and what works for your young person as well.
Well, there's a couple of questions there. At the top of the show, mentioned that it is sort of Neurodiversity Month, so we've got a few episodes this month related to all things neurodiversity. And if you have any questions you like answered, then please shoot them through to us, OTFC Group on Instagram, otherwise podcast@otfcgroup.au, and we'll try and answer them when we can.
Shout out to Fletch if you're listening to this before bed on the topic of sleep. We hope you had a good night's sleep as well. Thanks, Michael.
Settles to sleep with this podcast, listening to us. Maybe it puts him to sleep. Maybe that's what you guys need to put you to sleep. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.